Today we have some more actual history about the settlements of the American West. We will be reading about a major event that occurred in Colorado on November 29, 1864. This was an offensive attack by the Third Colorado Cavalry on an encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians. The attack was designed to punish this hostile group of Indians for numerous attacks on wagon trains and settlements that had occurred earlier in 1864, including the attack on the Hungate family, whose bodies had been put on public display in Denver to show the brutality of their attackers. We will be reading from this book, Indians of the Pike's Peak region. This book was published all the way back in 1914 by Irving Howbert. Howbert was a member of the Third Colorado Cavalry, and this is his first-hand account of the Battle of Sand Creek. He defends the attack as justified punishment of the Indians for their numerous raids and all-out war on the settlements in the spring and summer of 1864. After the battle and to this date, many have claimed that the attack was an unjustified massacre of peaceful Indians. Irving Howbert provides a long defense of the attack, some of which we will read at the end. He claims that several military officers had a jealous desire to smear Colonel John Chivington, the leader of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, who had been promoted over them, and since they could not criticize his success on the battlefield, they smeared the attack as an unprovoked massacre. It may be asked why we did not receive protection from the territorial authorities. The reason for this was that the territory was without funds or a military organization. The governor had repeatedly called the attention of the general governments to the helpless condition of our settlements and asked that government troops be sent out to protect them from the raids of the Indians. But at this time, the entire military force of the nation was employed in suppressing the rebellion, and little aid could be given. It is true that the companies of the 1st Regiment of the Colorado Cavalry were distributed along the frontier, seldom more than one company in a place. Scattered in this way over a wide extent of the country, they were of little or no use in the way of defense. Meanwhile, the Indians were in virtual possession of the lines of travel to the east. Every coach that came through from the Missouri River to Denver had to run the gauntlet. Some were riddled with bullets, others were captured and their passengers killed. Instances were known where the victims were roasted alive, shot full of arrows, and subjected to every kind of cruelty the savages could devise. Finally, after many urgent appeals, the governor of Colorado was permitted to organize a new regiment to be used in protecting the frontier settlements and in punishing the hostile Cheyennes and Arapahos. The term of service was to be 100 days. It was thought that by prompt action, signal punishment could be inflicted on the savages in that time. Lieutenant George L. Shoup of the 1st Colorado was commissioned as colonel of the new regiment, which was designated as the 3rd Regiment of the Colorado Volunteer Cavalry. Colonel Shoup had already proved himself to be a very able and efficient officer. He was afterward for many years United States Senator from the state of Idaho. From the day he received his appointment, he proceeded with great activity to organize his command. Recruiting officers had already been placed in almost every town in the territory, and in less than 30 days 800 or 900 men had been enlisted. 8 or 10 others from El Paso County besides myself joined the regiment at the first call. Among them were Anthony Bott, Robert Finley, Henry Coby, Samuel Murray, John Wolfe, A.J. Templeton, Henry Miller, and a number of others whose names I do not now remember. The recruits from El Paso County were combined with those from Pueblo County and mustered in as Company G at Denver on the 29th day of August, 1864. Our officers were O.H.P. Baxter of Pueblo, Captain, Joseph Graham of the same county, First Lieutenant, and A.J. Templeton of El Paso County, Second Lieutenant. Within a short time after we had been mustered in at Denver, we marched back through El Paso County and south to a point on the Arkansas River, 5 miles east of Pueblo, where we remained for the next 2 months, waiting for our equipment. Meanwhile, we were being drilled and prepared for active military duty. On the last day of October and the first day of November of that year, there was a tremendous snowstorm all over the region along the eastern base of the Rocky Mountains. The snowfall at our camp was 20 inches in depth. At Colorado City, it was over 2 feet on the level, and on the divide still deeper. All supplies for the company had to be brought to our camp by teams from the commissary department at Denver. The depth of snow now made this impossible. Consequently, in a few days we were entirely out of food. As there seemed to be no hope of relief within the near future, our captain instructed everyone who had a home to go there and remain until further notice. Half a dozen of us from El Paso County started out the following morning before daylight, and tramped laboriously all day and well into the night, through deep snow along the valley of the fountain. For a portion of the way, a wagon or two had gone over the road since the storm, making it so rough that walking along it was almost impossible. As a result, we were so tired by dusk that we would have traveled no further could we have found a place where food and shelter were to be obtained. But it was 11 o'clock that night before we could get any accommodations at all, and by that time we were utterly exhausted. We resumed our tramp the next morning, but I was 2 days in reaching my home in Colorado City, 25 miles distant. 2 weeks later, we were notified by our captain that provisions had been obtained, and that we should return to camp at once. We had already been clothed in the light blue uniform then used by the cavalry branch of the United States Army. Soon after our return to camp, we received our equipment of arms, ammunition, and the necessary accoutrements. The guns were old, out-of-date Austrian muskets of large bore, with paper cartridges from which we had to bite off the end when loading. These guns sent a bullet rather viciously, but one could never tell where it would hit. A little later on, our horses arrived. They were a motley-looking group, composed of every kind of an equine animal, from a pony to a plow horse. The saddles and bridles were the same as were used in the cavalry service, and were good of the kind. I had the misfortune to draw a raw-boned, square-built old plow horse, upon which thereafter I spent a good many uncomfortable hours. If the order came to trot, followed by an order to gallop, I had to get him well under way on a trot, and he would be going like the wind before I could bring him into the gallop. Meanwhile, his rough trot would be shaking me to pieces. From what I have said, it will be seen that our equipment, as to arms and mounts, was of the poorest kind. The main part of the regiment had been in camp near Denver during all this time. This inactivity had caused a great deal of complaint among the officers and enlisted men. For the most part, the regiment had been enlisted from the ranchmen, miners, and businessmen of the state, and it was the understanding that they were to be given immediate service against the hostile Indians. The delay was probably unavoidable, being caused by the inability of the government to promptly furnish the necessary horses and equipment, as the animals had to be sent from east of the Missouri River. The horses and equipment were received about the middle of November. A few days later, under the command of Colonel Shoup, the main part of the regiment, together with 3 companies of the 1st Colorado, started on its way south, towards a destination known only to the principal officers. The combined force was under the command of Colonel John M. Shivington, commander of the military district of Colorado. The company to which I belonged joined the regiment as it passed our camp, about the 25th of November, and from that time on our real hardships began. We marched steadily down the valley of the Arkansas River, going into camp at 7 or 8 o'clock every night, and by the time we had eaten supper and had taken care of our horses, it was after 10 o'clock. We were called out at 4 o'clock the next morning, and were on the move before daylight. In order that no news of our march should be carried to the Indians, every man we met on the road was taken in charge, and for the same purpose guards were placed at every ranch. About 4 o'clock in the evening of November 28th, we arrived at Fort Lyon, to the great surprise of its garrison. No one at the fort even knew that the regiment had left the vicinity of Denver. A picket guard was thrown around the fort to turn away any Indians that might be coming in, and also to prevent any of the trappers or Indian traders, who generally hung around there, from notifying the savages of our presence. Soon after our arrival at camp, we were told that the wagon train would be left behind at this point, and each man was instructed to secure from the commissary 2 or 3 pounds of raw bacon, and sufficient hard tack to last 3 or 4 days, which he was to carry in his saddlebags. At 8 o'clock that night, the regiment took up its line of march across the prairie, in a direction almost due north from Fort Lyon. Each company was formed into 4s, and we pushed on rapidly. All night long it was walk, trot, gallop, dismount, and lead. I had had very little sleep for 2 or 3 nights previously, and consequently this all-night march was very exhausting. During the latter part of the night, I would willingly have run the risk of being scalped by Indians for a half-hour's sleep. Sometime after midnight, our guide, intentionally as we thought, led us through one of the shallow lakes that are so plentiful on the plains of that region. He was understood to be more friendly to the Indians than to the whites, and perhaps he hoped our ammunition would get wet, and thus become ineffective in the anticipated engagements. During the night, in order to keep awake, we had been nibbling on our hardtack, which in the morning, much to our disgust, we found to be very much alive. It was a bright, clear, starlight night. The air was crisp and uncomfortably cool, as might be expected at that time of year. Just as the sun was coming up over the eastern hills, we reached the top of a ridge, and away off in the valley to the northwest we saw a great number of Indian tents, forming a village of unusual size. We knew at once that this village was our objective point. Off to the left between us and the village was a large number of Indian ponies. 2 or 3 minutes later, orders came directing our battalion to capture the herd. Under the command of a major of the regiment, we immediately started on the run in order to get between the ponies and the Indian camp, before our presence was discovered. We had not proceeded any great distance before we saw half a dozen Indians coming toward the herd from the direction of the camp, but on seeing our large force, they hesitated a moment and then started back as fast as their ponies could take them. We were not long in securing the herd, which consisted of between 500 and 600 ponies. The officer in command placed from 20 to 30 men in charge of the ponies, with instructions to drive them away to some point where they could be in no danger of recapture. The remainder of the battalion then started directly for the Indian camp, which lay over a little ridge to the north of us. Meanwhile, the main part of the command had marched at a rapid rate down the slope to Sand Creek, along the northern bank of which the Indian camp was located. Crossing the creek some distance to the eastward of the village, they marched rapidly westward along the north bank until near the Indian village, where they halted and the battle began. At the same time, our battalion was coming in from the south. This left an opening for the Indians to the westward up the valley of Sand Creek, and also to the northward across the hills towards the Smoky Hill River. Before our battalion had crossed the low ridge which cut off the view of the village at the point where we captured the ponies, and had come in sight of the village again, the firing had become general, and it made some of us, myself among the number, feel pretty queer. I am sure, speaking for myself, if I hadn't been too proud, I should have stayed out of the fight altogether. When we first came in sight of the Indian camp, there were a good many ponies not far away to the north of it, and now when we came in sight of the camp again, after we had captured the other herd, we saw large numbers of Indians, presumably squaws and children, hurrying northward on these ponies, out of the way of danger. After the engagement commenced, the Indian warriors concentrated along Sand Creek, using the high banks on either side as a means of defense. At this point, Sand Creek was about 200 yards wide, the banks on each side being almost perpendicular, and from 6 to 12 feet high. The engagement extended along this creek for 3 or 4 miles from the Indian encampments. Our capture of the ponies placed the Indians at a great disadvantage, for the reason that an Indian is not accustomed to fighting on foot. They were very nearly equal to us in numbers, and had they been mounted we should have had great difficulty in defeating them, as they were better armed than we were, and their ponies were much superior for military purposes to the horses of our commands. From the beginning of the engagement our battery did effective work, our shells, as a rule, keeping the Indians from concentrating in considerable numbers at any one point. However, at one place, soon after getting into the fight, I saw a line of 50 to 100 Indians receive a charge from one of our companies as steadily as veterans, and their shooting was so effective that our men were forced to fall back. Returning to the charge soon after, the troopers forced the Indians to retire from the banks of the creek, which they did, however in a very leisurely manner, leaving a large number of their dead upon the field. Our own company, Company G, became disorganized early in the fight, as did many of the other companies, and after that fought in little groups wherever it seemed that they could be most effective. After the first few shots I had no fear whatever, nor did I see any others displaying the least concern as to their own safety. The fight soon became general all up and down the valley, the Indians continuously firing from their places of defense along the banks, and a constant fusillade being kept up by the soldiers, who were shooting at every Indian that appeared. I think it was in this way that a good many of the squaws were killed. It was utterly impossible at a distance of 200 yards to discern between the sexes, on account of their similarity of dress. As our detachment moved up the valley, we frequently came in line of the firing, and the bullets whizzed past us rather unpleasantly, but fortunately none of us was hurt. At one point we ran across a wounded man, a former resident of El Paso County, but then a member of a company from another county. A short time previously, as he passed too near the bank, a squaw had shot an arrow into his shoulder, inflicting a very painful wound. He was being cared for by the members of his own company. A little further up the creek we crossed over to the north side, and then moved leisurely up the valley, shooting at the Indians whenever they were in sight. By this time most of them had burrowed into the soft sand of the banks, which formed a place of defense for them from which they could shoot at the whites, while only slightly exposing themselves. Soon after, we joined a detachment which was carrying on a brisk engagement with a considerable force of Indians, some of whom were hidden behind one of the many large piles of driftwood along the banks of Sand Creek, while others were sheltered behind a similar pile in the center of the creek, which was unusually wide at that point. Our men were posted in a little depression just back from the north bank, from which some of them had crawled forward as far as they dared go, and were shooting into the driftwood, in the hope of driving the Indians from cover. Soon after I reached this point, a member of the company from Boulder, who had stepped out a little too far, and then turned around to speak to one of us, was shot in the back, the bullet going straight through his lungs and chest. Realizing at once that he was badly wounded, probably fatally so, he asked to be taken to his company. I volunteered to accompany him, and after helping him on his horse, we started across the prairie to where his company was supposed to be. With every breath, bubbles of blood were coming from his lungs, and I had little hope that he would reach his comrades alive. Just as we reached the company, he fainted, and was caught by his captain as he was falling from his horse. I returned immediately to the place I had left, and found the battle still going on. During my absence, our little force had been considerably increased by soldiers from other parts of the battlefield. It was now decided to make it so hot for the savages by continuous firing that they would be compelled to leave their places of cover. Soon 2 or 3 of the Indians exposed themselves and were instantly shot down. In a short time the remainder started across the creek, towards its southern bank. They ran in a zigzag manner, jumping from one side to the other, evidently hoping by doing so that we would be unable to hit them, but by taking deliberate aim, we dropped every one before they reached the other bank. About this time, orders came from the commanding officer directing us to return at once to the Indian camp, as information had been received that a large force of Indians was coming from the Smoky Hill River to attack us. Obeying this order, we marched leisurely down the creek, and as we went, we were repeatedly fired at by Indians hidden in the banks in the manner I have described heretofore. We returned the fire, but the savages were so well protected that we had no reason to think any of our shots had proved effective. At one place, an Indian child 3 or 4 years of age ran out to us, holding up its hands and crying piteously. From its actions we inferred that it wished to be taken up. At first I was inclined to do so, but changed my mind when it occurred to me that I should have no means of taking care of the little fellow. We knew that there were Indians concealed within a couple 100 yards of where we were, who certainly would take care of him as soon as we were out of the way. Consequently, we left him to be cared for by his own people. Every one of our party expressed sympathy for the little fellow, and no one dreamed of harming him. As we neared the Indian camp, we passed the place where the severest fighting had occurred earlier in the day, and here we saw many dead Indians, a few of whom were squaws. At the edge of the camp we came upon our own dead who had been brought in and placed in a row. There were 10 of them, and we were informed that there were 40 wounded in a hospital improvised for the occasion. Among the dead I expected to find the Boulder man whom I had taken to his company, but strange to relate, he survived his wounds, and I saw him 2 or 3 years afterwards, apparently entirely recovered. The number of our dead and wounded showed that the Indians had offered a vigorous defense. And as I have before stated, if they had been mounted, it is questionable whether the result would have been the same had they remained to fight. We reached the Indian camp about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the battle having continued without cessation from early morning until that time. The companies were immediately placed in position to form a hollow square, inside of which our horses were picketed. I was so utterly exhausted for want of sleep and food, as were many others of our company, that I hunted up a buffalo robe, of which there were large numbers scattered around, threw myself down on it, and was asleep almost as soon as I touched the ground. The next thing I remember was being awakened for supper about dusk. We were told that we must sleep with our guns in hands, ready for use at any moment. Near midnight, we were awakened by a more than vigorous call of our officers, ordering us to fall into line immediately and repel an attack. We rushed out, but in our sleepy condition had difficulty in forming a line, as we hardly knew what we were doing. In the evening, by order of the commanding officer, all the Indian tents outside of our encampment had been set on fire, and were now blazing brightly all around us. We heard occasional shots in various directions, and in the light of the fire saw what looked to be hundreds of Indian ponies running hither and thither. We saw no Indians, but we knew that savages in an encounter always lie on the side of their ponies, opposite from the enemies they are attacking. From the number of what seemed to be horses that could be seen in every direction, we thought that we should surely be overwhelmed. After forming in line and while waiting for the attack, we discovered that what in our sleepy condition we had imagined to be ponies was nothing but the numerous dogs of the Indian camp, which, having lost their masters, were running wildly in every direction. Nevertheless, it was evident that the Indians were all around us, as our pickets had been fired upon and driven in from every side of the camp. After remaining in line for a considerable length of time, without being attacked, the regiment was divided into 2 divisions, one of which was marched 50 feet in front of the other. We were then instructed to get our blankets and, wrapping ourselves in them, with our guns handy, we lay down and slept the remainder of the night. In the Indian camp we found an abundance of flour, sugar, bacon, coffee, and other articles of food sufficient for our maintenance had we needed it for a time. In many of the tents there were articles of wearing apparel and other things that had been taken from the wagon trains which the Indians had robbed during the previous summer. In these same tents we found a dozen or more scalps of white people, some of them being from the heads of women and children, as was evidenced by the color and fineness of the hair, which could not be mistaken for that of any other race. One of the scalps showed plainly from its condition that it had been taken only recently. Certain members of our regiment found horses and mules in the Indian herd that had been stolen from them by the hostiles in their various raids during the preceding year. The camp was overflowing with proof that these Indians were among those who had been raiding the settlements of Colorado during the previous summer, killing people, robbing wagon trains, burning houses, running off stock, and committing outrages of which only a savage could be guilty. This evidence only corroborated in the strongest possible manner what we already knew. Among the members of our regiment, there were many who had had friends and relatives killed, scalped, and mutilated by these Indians, and almost every man had sustained financial loss by reason of their raids. Consequently, it is not surprising they should be determined to inflict such punishment upon the savages as would deter them from further raids upon our settlements. Notwithstanding the fact that this grim determination was firmly fixed in the mind of everyone, I never saw any one deliberately shoot at a squaw, nor do I believe that any children were intentionally killed. About noon of the day following the battle, our wagon train came up, and was formed into a hollow square in the center of our camp, the lines being drawn in so that if necessary the wagons could be used as a means of defense. We knew that on the Smoky Hill River from 50 to 75 miles distance, there was another large body of Cheyennes and Arapahoes, which might attack us at any time. In every direction throughout the day, many Indians were seen hovering around our camp. Scouting parties were seldom able to get very far away from camp without being fired upon, and several of our men were killed and a number wounded in the skirmishes that took place. During the second night of our stay on the battlegrounds, we were kept in line continuously, with our arms ready for use at a moment's notice. At intervals during the night, there was an exchange of shots at various points around the camp. I never understood why we did not follow up our victory by an attack upon the hostile bands camped at the Smoky Hill River, but I assume it was on account of our regiment's inferior horses, arms, and equipment. Probably Colonel Shivington, taking this into consideration, thought his force not strong enough to fight such a large party successfully. The following day the command took up its line of march down the Big Sandy, and followed it to the Arkansas River, then easterly along the north side of that stream to the western boundary of Kansas. Soon after we reached the Arkansas River, we found the trail of a very large party of Indians traveling down the valley. They seemed to be in great haste to get away from us, as they had thrown away their camp kettles, buffalo robes, and everything that might impede their flight. Realizing that the Indians could not be overtaken with the whole command, on account of the poor condition of many of the horses, our officers specially detailed 300 of our best mounted and best armed men, and sent them forward in pursuit under a forced march. But even this plan was unsuccessful, and the pursuit was finally abandoned when near the Kansas line. The term of enlistment of our regiment had already expired, for which reason the command was reluctantly faced about, and the return march to Denver begun. From the time we left the Sand Creek battlegrounds, it had been very cold and disagreeable. Sharp, piercing winds blew from the north almost incessantly, making us extremely uncomfortable during the day, and even more so at night. Being without tents and compelled to sleep on the open prairie, with no protection whatever from the winds, at times we found the cold almost unbearable. The thin, shoddy government blankets afforded only the slightest possible protection against the bitter winds. Consequently, those were fortunate indeed who could find a gully in which to make their bed. Our march back to Denver was leisurely and uneventful. We reached there in due course and were mustered out of service on the 29th day of December, 1864. We dispersed to our homes, convinced that we had done a good work, and that it needed only a little further punishment of the savages to permanently settle the Indian trouble so far as this territory was concerned. Few events in American history have been the subject of so much misrepresentation as the Battle of Sand Creek. It has gone down into history as an indefensible massacre of peaceable Indians, and perhaps nothing can now be said that will change this erroneous impression of the world at large, notwithstanding the fact that the accusation is unjust and a libel upon the people of Colorado. Worst of all, it was given wide publicity through the reports of 2 congressional committees following unfair, one-sided, and prejudiced investigations. Unfortunately, at that time, Colorado, being a territory, had no senators or representatives in Congress to defend the good name of its people, and to add to the bad features of the situation, its people at home realized but dimly what was taking place at Washington, until after the mischief was done. Consequently, to a great extent, the congressional investigations went by default, so far as the people of Colorado were concerned. It should be kept in mind that Colorado, comparatively speaking, was more remote from the rest of the world at that time than Alaska is today, and the means of disseminating news throughout the territory were exceedingly limited. From early in November of 1864 until March 1865, the coaches that carried the mail between the Missouri River towns and Denver ceased running on account of the hostility of the Indians, and all this time Colorado was cut off from the rest of the world, except for a limited telegraph service that did not reach any point in the territory outside of Denver. Consequently, the enemies of Colonel Chivington and the Third Colorado Cavalry had full sway in their efforts to blacken the reputation of these representative citizens of Colorado. I wish to emphasize the fact that a large majority of the members of the Third Colorado Cavalry were high-class men. Whatever may be said to the contrary, Colorado had been settled less than 6 years, and most of its inhabitants had come to the territory in 1860, only 4 years previously. These people were from every part of the United States, many of them farmers, merchants, and professional men. And the men who enlisted in the Third Colorado were largely of this class. The accusations on which the various congressional and military investigations were based had their origin in the jealousy of military officers. It was the same kind of spirit that caused the loss of more than one battle in the Civil War. However, at Sand Creek, on account of the secrecy of preparations, the victory could not be prevented, but the good effects could be and were completely nullified, to the great detriment of the people of Colorado. And this was done by officers who had been former residents of the territory, and were indebted to it for their official positions. But fully to understand the animus of these officers, it is necessary for the reader to know something of their personality, as well as that of the other officers involved in the controversy. Colonel John M. Chivington, who was in command at the Battle of Sand Creek, and who was the principal target throughout the various investigations, was the Reverend John M. Chivington, who from 1860 to 1862 was in charge of the Methodist missions in the region, now forming the state of Colorado. He was a member of the Kansas-Nebraska Conference, and had been selected for this work largely because of his unusual energy, ability, and force of character. The commanding position that the Methodist Church early assumed in the territory under his administration confirmed the wisdom of his appointments. Upon the organization of the 1st Colorado Volunteer Cavalry in the early part of 1862, Mr. Shivington resigned his position as presiding elder of the Rocky Mountain District and was commissioned major of the new regiments. He at once became the regiment's most influential officer. He was the most prominent figure in its wonderful march to New Mexico, and the remarkable victories won by it over the invading Confederates were largely due to his brilliant leadership. By the end of the active campaign, which was a short one, Major Shivington had become so popular with the officers and enlisted men that upon the resignation of John P. Sloth, the colonel of the regiment, soon after he was promoted to that position over Lieutenant Colonel Samuel F. Tappan, on petition of every commissioned officer of the regiment, as will be seen further along in my narrative. Later, Colonel Shivington was appointed by General Canby to the command of the military district of southern New Mexico, and was afterwards transferred to the command of the military district of Colorado, which position he held at the Battle of Sand Creek. Colonel Shivington was a man of commanding personality and possessed marked ability both as a preacher and as an army officer. The overshadowing reputation made by Colonel Shivington in the campaign against the Texas invaders of New Mexico, and his subsequent promotion to the colonelcy of the regiment over Lieutenant Colonel Samuel F. Tappan, although apparently acquiesced in at the time, aroused a spirit of jealousy, envy, and antagonism against him on the part of a small group of officers headed by Lieutenant Colonel Tappan and Major E.W. Wynkoop, which was participated in by Captain Sewell, Lieutenant Kramer, and other subordinates. This antagonism manifested itself on every later occasion. It was the jealousy of mediocrity, manifested against superior ability and worth. For one can search the records of the 1st Colorado in vain for anything noteworthy ever accomplished by either Tappan, Wynkoop, or Sewell. After their return from New Mexico, these officers never allowed an opportunity to pass for discrediting and injuring the preacher colonel, and after the Battle of Sand Creek, they never tired of referring to it as evidence of his unfitness. Lieutenant Colonel Tappan had been a professional newspaper correspondent before entering the Army. Consequently, he had no trouble in filling the Eastern publications with exaggerated and distorted accounts of the battle. In his crusade, he had the active aid of Major Wynkoop, of S.G. Colley, the Indian agent at Fort Lyon, and of all the Indian traders, interpreters, half-breeds, and others of similar character congregated around the Indian Agency. He also had the support of the Indian Bureau at Washington, which usually took the sentimental side of every question affecting the Indians. Prior to 1864, Indians who had been on the warpath during the summer were permitted to make peace in the fall, remain unmolested during the winter, receive annuities, rest up, and accumulate ammunition for the coming summer's raids. But in that year, the overtures of the Cheyennes and Arapahoes were rejected, except upon the condition that they deliver up their arms and submit to the military authorities. This they not only refused to do, but continued their depredations at places convenient to their winter camps, and received from Colonel Shivington's command the punishment they so richly deserved. Naturally, this meant great financial loss to the Indian agents, traders, and hangers-on around the Indian Agency, and as a result, these people actively joined in the attack upon Colonel Shivington. This crusade resulted in 2 congressional investigations of the battle, and also in a hearing by a military commission. Before the Joint Special Committee of the 2 Houses of Congress, the principal witnesses were Major Wynkoop, Captain Sewell, Lieutenant Kramer, 2 Indian agents, 2 Indian traders, 2 half-breeds, and 1 interpreter to sustain the accusations, and only Governor Evans and 3 minor officers of the 3rd Colorado Regiment for the defense. Aside from Governor Evans and the 3 minor officers just mentioned, the witnesses were extremely hostile to Colonel Shivington, and were willing to go to any length in the testimony to blacken his reputation and that of the 3rd Colorado. In the investigation before the Joint Special Committee, neither Colonel Shivington nor Colonel Shoup was present or represented in any way. In the hearing before the Committee of the Conduct of the War, Colonel Shoup was not represented and Colonel Shivington only by means of a deposition. As a result of these partial and one-sided investigations, both committees condemned Shivington and pronounced the battle a massacre. The most unjust and absurd investigation of all was that made by the Military Commission, which was composed of 3 officers of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, all subordinates of Colonel Shivington, headed by his inveterate enemy, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel F. Tappan. The accusation made at each hearing was that the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, attacked by Colonel Shivington's command at Sand Creek, were not only friendly to the whites, but were under the protection of the military authorities at Fort Lyon, and that the battle was, by the consent, if not by the direction of Colonel Shivington, an indiscriminate massacre. All of this, I believe, is proved to be untrue, to the satisfaction of any reasonable person, by the facts related in my account of the battle, and of the hostilities in El Paso County and elsewhere preceding it. So that's it for this episode, A Defense of the Battle of Sand Creek, written by Irving Howbert back in 1914. He wrote this 50 years after he participated in the battle when he was just 18 years old. He provides a motive of jealousy as the reason why Samuel Tappan and others stirred up outrage over the battle. One of the strongest criticisms of the attack and the U.S. Army's actions are that the Indians were waving a white flag and an American flag, and that they had been led to believe that they were under the protection of the soldiers at Fort Lyon. This is likely true. However, Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington's position was that they were still at war, and not willing to make peace with the Indians. They knew the Indians were only making peace for the winter, and that they would simply rest up, resupply, and engage in war again in the spring of 1865. It seems clear that this was an encampment of hostile Indians, who had conducted numerous raids and attacks on men, women, and children. An even stronger criticism of the attack is that the U.S. Army killed and mutilated the bodies of men, women, and children. They were said to have cut off fingers, toes, scalps, and other body parts as souvenirs of the battle. Irving Howbert gives a weaker defense of this charge. He notes one point where a young Indian boy appears, and they let him go without harming him, and says he never saw any soldier intentionally hurt a child. While it's possible that he and the soldiers in his company did not intentionally harm any women or children, it seems likely that at least some of the reported outrages did occur. We also read only a small part of Irving Howbert's defense of the battle. There is another 63 pages in this book, and the chapters devoted to the defense of Sand Creek. We may cover his defense of Sand Creek further in future episodes on this channel. Let us know in the comments what you think of this defense of the Battle of Sand Creek, back on November 29, 1864. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is now considered unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel we keep this worthy history of our country alive by reading directly from old books, written down long ago by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support the mission of this channel, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to our members-only videos, and your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.